The village of Midsomer Haven lay beneath a soft blanket of frost, its stone cottages rimmed with the delicate sparkle of early winter ice. Smoke drifted from the chimneys in curling wisps, mingling with the scent of burning wood, and the faint tang of evergreen from wreaths hung on every door. Children's laughter echoed across the cobbled streets as they skated and slid, cheeks flushed crimson against the cold, while the occasional cry of a bell signalled a visitor or the approaching cart of the milkman. Amongst this quintessential English village stood Willoughby Manor, a sprawling estate whose red brick walls and ivy-clad facades were softened by the frost. The gardens, neatly trimmed, bore the last hints of winter roses, their petals edged with ice. The hall's windows glowed warmly from within, promising refuge from the chill and a hint of the imminent Christmas cheer. It was here, in the grand oak panelled dining-room, that preparations for the annual Christmas fête were underway. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her old friend Mrs. Lillian Carrington, had arrived earlier that morning, her grey tweed coat buttoned snugly, scarf tucked neatly, and her knitting basket swinging lightly from her arm. She surveyed the scene with her usual shrewd eyes, noting everything from the expressions of the servants to the careful arrangements of holly and ivy along the mantelpieces. "Good morning, Jane. You're just in time, Mrs." Carrington exclaimed, a petite woman with silver, streaked hair and an ever-present sparkle in her eye. She bustled past Miss Marple, smoothing her floral apron over a winter dress of deep green. "The cake is being brought out, and Clara is positively radiant with excitement. You must see it before anything untoward happens." Miss Marple smiled faintly, adjusting her spectacles. "I shall, Lillian, but you do know, anticipation itself can be trying on nerves." She allowed herself a small twinkle of humour, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the scene. The characters before the drama unfolded. It was necessary to take stock of the household and visitors. Mrs. Lillian Carrington, lady of Willoughby Manor, gracious, meticulous, and slightly frazzled by the holiday preparations. She had a fondness for flowers and a reputation for impeccable taste in hosting. Henry Willoughby, the Manor's young heir, recently returned from London, tall, composed, with a charming smile, though one that masked a streak of arrogance. He had been the cause of mild village scandal over a business disagreement and a rumoured romantic entanglement. Miss Cecilia Harrow Long, time housekeeper, precise, protective of the Manor's reputation, and intensely loyal to the family. She had eyes everywhere and a mind sharper than many suspected. Clara Dunlop, village baker and confectioner, responsible for the prized Christmas cake. Warm and kind-hearted, with a streak of pride in her creations. Reverend Edward Pritchard, local vicar, a gentle man with a keen sense of human nature, often the first to sense trouble beneath polite exteriors. Mrs. Agnes Fennel, village gossip extraordinaire, delighted to note every slight quarrel and unusual behaviour. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, though her stories were sometimes embellished. The grand hall was now a hive of activity. Servants moved swiftly, arranging plates and silverware, dusting the polished oak, and ensuring every ornament was perfectly positioned. Outside, the faint clatter of the horse-drawn cart signalled the arrival of the Christmas cakes, delivered with ceremonial care by Clara Dunlop herself. She carried the centrepiece cake, a magnificent creation adorned with marzipan holly, delicate sugar berries, and tiny marzipan figurines that seemed almost alive in their detail. "It's my finest yet," Clara declared proudly, her flower, dusted hands adjusting a sprig of holly on the cake. "It has all the traditional ingredients, the cherries, the almonds, the preserved fruit, everything exactly as it should be." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, noting the faint, almost imperceptible scent of bitter almonds in the air. It was subtle, easily dismissed amidst the fragrance of oranges and spices, but her intuition told her to keep it in mind. the inciting incident, the villagers, invited to partake in the fete, gathered in the hall. The atmosphere was cheerful but tinged with anticipation. Henry Willoughby, ever the centre of attention, insisted on making the first cut of the cake. "Clara, you've outdone yourself as always," he said, flashing a charming grin. "I hope this cake tastes as good as it looks." The knife sliced through the marzipan smoothly, and Henry took a generous bite. For a moment the world seemed perfect. Clinking of cups, laughter, and gentle music from a small pianoforte in the corner. Then suddenly Henry staggered. His face twisted in shock and pain, and he collapsed onto the polished oak floor. Gasps filled the room. "Henry!" Mrs. Carrington cried, rushing to his side. "Someone fetch Reverend Pritchard." Reverend Pritchard hurried forward, his hands trembling slightly, but his composure quickly returned as he knelt beside Henry. Despite all efforts, slapping his face, fanning him, and administering rudimentary remedies, the young man's breath became faint, his eyes dimmed, and then he was gone. The room descended into chaos. Guests murmured, some weeping, others frozen with disbelief. Clara clutched her apron, white, faced and trembling. It couldn't have been anything I did. I don't understand." Miss Marple, however, remained calm. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap as she observed quietly. Small telling details caught her attention: the faint almond scent lingering near the cake, the slight smudge on the cake knife, not consistent with normal serving, subtle expressions on the villagers' faces, shock mingled with something else, something akin to guilt, anxiety, or secret relief. She made a mental note. This was no simple accident. Early observations. Once the initial commotion settled, Miss Marple began to piece together a preliminary understanding. Henry had several rivals, both within the manor and the village. There were whispers about financial disputes, romantic entanglements, and even secret resentments that might motivate someone to murder. The cake itself had been exclusively prepared by Clara, though access to the kitchen was technically available to Cecilia Harrow and the staff. The timing and method suggested a subtle, calculated act, one that could easily be mistaken for an accident in the chaos of a festive gathering. Reverend Pritchard, approaching with gentle authority, placed a hand on Miss Marple's arm. "Jane, I trust you'll keep a level head. People are frightened, and frightened people sometimes speak before they should." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, Edward, sometimes the smallest observations tell the most important truths." Her eyes scanned the room once more, resting briefly on Clara, who was nervously wringing her hands, and in that moment the seasoned detective in her understood that the seemingly perfect village Christmas had just become a puzzle, and a deadly one at that. The aftermath of Henry Willoughby's sudden collapse left Willoughby Manor in an uneasy hush. The grand hall, once filled with festive chatter, now felt hollow, its polished floors echoing faintly under the careful steps of servants and guests alike. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, carefully folded her knitting and allowed her keen eyes to wander. People behaved differently when tragedy struck. A quiver of a lip, a slight avoidance of another's gaze, a nervous hand brushing a sleeve. Every detail mattered. "Jane," Mrs. Carrington whispered, placing a trembling hand on her friend's arm, "you must help me understand. How could this happen? He was fine one moment and gone the next." Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes soft but unyielding. "We shall understand, Lillian, but one must not rush. The truth often emerges from small things overlooked by everyone else. Clara Dunlop." The baker's pride and panic. Miss Marple decided to begin with Clara Dunlop, the baker who had prepared the ill-fated cake. Clara, still trembling, led Miss Marple to the kitchen. The room smelled richly of almonds, candied fruit, and warm sugar, but beneath it lingered something faintly acrid. "Oh, Miss Marple," Clara said, wringing her hands. I could never harm anyone. I made that cake as I always do, every ingredient measured with care, every decoration placed with love. I swear it. Miss Marple examined the cake's remains. She noted the small marzipan holly sprigs, the tiny sugar figurines, and the slight smear along the edge where the knife had cut. Tell me, Clara, she asked softly, did anyone have access to the kitchen overnight? Clara's face paled. No one, save for Cecilia. I was sure she locked the door, but perhaps someone came while I was fetching the eggs from the pantry, but that would be impossible, wouldn't it? Miss Marple made no immediate reply. Instead, she observed the baker's fingers, the flour under her nails, the way her eyes darted to the unused utensils. Every detail could be significant. Cecilia Harrow, the watchful housekeeper, next. Miss Marple turned to Cecilia Harrow, the Manor's long-time housekeeper. Cecilia stood stiffly by the pantry, her hands clasped tightly. I am responsible for this house, Miss Marple, she said, voice firm. I ensure everything is in order. I checked the kitchen last night. No one entered after me. If anyone poisoned that cake, I would have known. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Indeed, Cecilia, but sometimes even the most careful eyes can miss a small detail. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual yesterday evening? Cecilia hesitated. Well, I thought I saw someone near the larder, but it could have been my imagination. Everyone was bustling about, it was. Crowded. Miss Marple murmured, her mind quietly cataloguing the information. And the deliveries, were there any packages, ingredients, or unusual purchases? Cecilia shook her head. Clara brought all her own ingredients. Nothing else arrived, save for a parcel from London addressed to Henry. He said it was unimportant. Miss Marple made a mental note. A mysterious parcel, unaccounted for by others, might hold significance. The village gossip, Mrs. Agnes Fennel. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sought Mrs. Agnes Fennel, whose sharp eyes and penchant for observation often revealed details no one else noticed. Agnes, sipping tea in her rose-printed sitting-room, leaned forward eagerly. Jane, I thought it suspicious from the start, she began. Henry had so many enemies. That young man was always arrogant, always asserting his superiority. Did you see the way he argued with young Willoughby's solicitor last week, and the land negotiations? Well, I shouldn't say, but people were angry. Miss Marple sipped her tea calmly, listening. Indeed, Mrs. Fennel, and did you notice anything unusual yesterday? Any strange visitors, packages, or late-night activity? Agnes tapped her chin. Now that you mention it, there was a carriage that arrived very late, after dusk. I couldn't see who it was, but one never knows, of course. It could have been nothing. Miss Marple nodded silently. Her mind quietly assembled the pattern of subtle tensions, rivalries, resentments, secret deliveries, and minor quarrels, all ordinary in a village, yet potentially deadly when combined with opportunity. The second guest falls ill by late afternoon. A second, smaller incident occurred. Mrs. Carrington's niece, Eliza, tasted a small piece of leftover cake. She shivered violently, eyes watering, and had to be assisted to a chair. Fortunately, she recovered quickly, but the incident confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. The cake had been tampered with. A careful examination of the remaining cake, combined with knowledge of the ingredients, suggested the presence of a poison, likely hidden in one of the small marzipan decorations. Miss Marple observed Clara and Cecilia again, noting every gesture and expression. Early clues and observations: faint almond scent consistent with cyanide, cake knife smudges not aligned with normal serving. Someone may have handled it with intent. footprints faint in the frosty garden, suggesting someone approached the kitchen late at night. Unaccounted parcel delivered to Henry from London, timing suspicious, subtle expressions hesitation, guilt, or anxiety displayed by staff and guests. Miss Marple also reflected on human nature, observing how minor tensions and unspoken resentments often escalated when opportunity presented itself. She quietly concluded that the killer was someone close to the manor, familiar with both the household routines and the precise methods of cake preparation. Interviews and subtle interrogation over the next day, Miss Marple spoke privately with the main suspects, employing her signature gentle yet incisive questioning. Henry's business rivals, they claimed indifference, but subtle gestures, clenched fists, quick glances, betrayed suppressed animosity. Servants and staff, careful questioning revealed discrepancies in stories about nighttime movements and access to ingredients. Villagers with minor grudges, Miss Marple noted who avoided eye contact or spoke too quickly, signs of either fear or deceit. Each conversation, though seemingly ordinary, added pieces to the puzzle. Miss Marple considered timing, opportunity, and motive carefully. One detail in particular stood out. The second minor poisoning incident suggested the act had been deliberate and planned, not an accident. Internal reflection that evening, as snow began to fall outside the manor's windows, Miss Marple sat by the fire in the drawing-room. Her knitting lay forgotten. She mused, people often underestimate the quiet ones, the unnoticed ones, yet it is they who observe most keenly, and act when the opportunity presents itself. One must look at the small details, the habits, the little gestures. Therein lies the truth. She glanced again at Cecilia Harrow, who was arranging the firewood nearby. Something about the housekeeper's posture, the way her fingers lingered on certain utensils, made Miss Marple's instincts tingle. The investigation had begun in earnest, and already Miss Marple sensed that Willoughby Manor held secrets deeper than anyone suspected. The charming facade of a festive Christmas was slipping, revealing a tension that ran through the estate like a hidden current, waiting to surface. The following morning, Willoughby Manor felt heavier than the frost-laden air outside. Guests and villagers moved quietly through the corridors, exchanging tentative glances and murmuring low condolences. Yet beneath this subdued atmosphere, tension simmered, and Miss Marple, ever observant, could detect it in every stiff posture and whispered conversation. She began the day with a review of her observations, seated at the manor's writing desk with a notebook, sipping warm tea. So many small clues, she mused quietly, and yet the larger picture eludes most. One must consider not only who had the opportunity, but who might have wanted Henry gone. Suspicious behaviours. First red herrings, Miss Marple began to test the theories forming in her mind. Reverend Edward Pritchard was first. He had assisted during the incident, showing kindness and composure, yet Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease when certain names were mentioned. Edward, she asked casually, you were aware of Henry's recent disagreements over the village lands? The vicar's face tightened slightly. I suggested he reconsider, yes. But Jane, I assure you I am no murderer. Advice does not equal malice. Miss Marple nodded, aware of the truth in his words. Yet she recorded the hesitation, knowing that even innocent fear can mirror guilt. Next, she observed Cecilia Harrow, the housekeeper. Cecilia was meticulous, almost obsessive about the manor's order. She avoided eye contact when Miss Marple spoke of the kitchen the previous night. It is not the trembling hands or anxious looks that often betray a culprit, Miss Marple noted to herself, but the small inconsistencies in memory and movement. Even Clara Dunlop, the baker, seemed to evade full eye contact. Her hands, still dusted lightly with flour from that morning, twisted nervously. New developments as the investigation unfolded. A second, unrelated incident seemed to muddy the waters further: the theft of a small parcel. A box had arrived for Henry from London, reportedly containing personal documents. It was now missing, and no one could account for it. Miss Marple deduced that the missing parcel could be a key piece of the puzzle, perhaps containing evidence or instructions. Its disappearance introduced a new layer of intrigue. Simultaneously, subtle conflicts among the villagers began surfacing. Agnes Fennel, ever eager to comment, remarked that Henry had quarrelled with several local families over the purchase of land, and that resentment had been brewing for months. Miss Marple made a quiet note: the motive could extend beyond the household. Yet her instinct whispered that the act of poisoning had required intimate knowledge of the manor, suggesting an insider. Interpersonal conflicts, potential motives. Miss Marple next met Henry's business rival, James Felton, who had been visiting the manor the previous week. Felton was charming but defensive. Miss Marple, I might have had disagreements with Henry, but I assure you, murder, preposterous. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him. James, it is often the seemingly insignificant quarrels that conceal the sharpest resentment. He laughed nervously. I see. And do you intend to accuse me, then? Not yet, Miss Marple replied with a small, knowing smile. One must consider both the heart and the habits of men. The conversation, though inconclusive, revealed hidden tensions. Financial rivalry, romantic jealousy, and village gossip had all created fertile ground for suspicion. Minor clues point in multiple directions, the cake knife smudge still unexplained. It could indicate someone handled the cake deliberately. Bitter almond smell suggests poison. Footprints in the frosted garden, someone had entered the manor during the night. Missing parcel could hold crucial documents or a motive clue. Behavioral quirks, hesitation, glances, and defensive gestures from housekeeper and villagers alike. Miss Marple began to see a pattern emerge, but she also noted how easily small clues could mislead. A false move in judgment could point suspicion in the wrong direction entirely. The second poisoning incident revisited the minor illness suffered by Eliza Carrington, Mrs. Carrington's niece, now took on renewed significance. Miss Marple considered, if Henry's death was deliberate, the second incident could have been an unintended consequence or a warning. The timing and location of the illness suggested careful planning, yet possibly not executed by the same hand entirely, introducing a red herring. She pondered, reflecting. Sometimes those who appear most innocent may conceal secrets, and those who seem suspicious may be falsely accused by circumstance. One must examine each motive, each opportunity, and each small gesture. A new visitor adds complexity. Late that afternoon, Margaret Willoughby, Henry's distant cousin, arrived unexpectedly from London. She had been travelling and was unaware of the tragedy. Her presence immediately complicated the investigation. She had known of the parcel sent to Henry. She seemed particularly interested in the family finances, raising questions about potential inheritance. Her arrival stirred subtle tension among villagers and staff. Miss Marple observed her interactions carefully. Margaret was polite, almost overly formal, yet there was a spark of urgency in her questions about the missing documents. Rising suspense, Miss Marple spent the evening walking through the manor, examining the kitchen, pantry, and the path from the garden. Each detail confirmed her growing suspicion. The crime was meticulously planned, and the culprit had intimate knowledge of the household routines. She also revisited the guest statements. Small inconsistencies appeared. Times did not match, descriptions conflicted, and some alibis seemed rehearsed. Behavioral clues, though subtle, were telling. She sensed that a confrontation or confession would require careful orchestration. False leads begin to fray in the days that followed. Reverend Pritchard continued to appear nervous, but careful observation revealed no tangible link to the crime. James Felton seemed increasingly irate at the gossip, yet had no real opportunity to commit the act. Margaret Willoughby's interest in the missing parcel appeared innocent at first, though her inquiries were persistent. Miss Marple began to understand the value of red herrings in human behaviour. People often create their own misdirection through fear, guilt, or self-interest, obscuring the real perpetrator. Internal reflection. Marple's method that night. Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting again, reflecting on the patterns she had observed. People are much like recipes, she mused. A small deviation, one added spice, one missing ingredient, can change the outcome entirely, and just as in baking in crime, a small detail overlooked can mean the difference between success and discovery. She considered the culprit's likely profile, must have access to the kitchen, must understand Henry's habits and preferences, could plan an act that appeared accidental, likely a person trusted and unnoticed, whose small gestures would deflect suspicion. The picture was gradually forming, but Miss Marple knew she must wait for the right moment. One slip of the tongue, one gesture, or one overlooked detail would reveal everything. Miss Marple, standing in the kitchen late at night, examined the frost-patterned footprints leading from the pantry door to the garden. The crisp snow had preserved the subtle tread of a slippered foot, and faint traces of flour, almost imperceptible, marked the tiles. She whispered to herself, so the pattern is clear. Only one person could have done this without fear of immediate discovery, and yet they think themselves cleverer than the rest of us. The stakes were rising. The killer remained at large, the villagers unaware of the truth, and the Manor's festive cheer now overshadowed by hidden malice. The morning sun fell pale and frosty over Willoughby Manor, illuminating the gardens where snow still clung to the hedges, and the pathways glimmered under a thin glaze of ice. Inside, the manor had begun to regain a semblance of calm, though a tension lingered in the air, like the faint scent of smoke after a hearth has been extinguished. Miss Marple walked slowly through the corridors, observing every detail, the slight disarray of a silver tray, the positioning of the cake knife on the sideboard, the way the staff avoided one another's eyes. "Yes, the pieces are coming together," she murmured, her knitting basket swinging lightly from her arm. "Every gesture, every hesitation, every unspoken word is a clue if one knows where to look." Consolidating the clues by now, Miss Marple had amassed a small mountain of evidence and observations. Bitter almond scent indicating cyanide or another fast-acting poison. Cake knife smudges, deliberate handling inconsistent with normal serving. Footprints in the frost late, night intrusions pointing to someone familiar with the manor, missing parcel from London potentially holding documents, letters or instructions. Second, minor poisoning evidence of planned poisoning or warning. Subtle behavioral inconsistencies, nervous glances, fleeting expressions, contradictions in alibis. Miss Marple considered each suspect carefully. Reverend Pritchard anxious, yes, but no opportunity. James Felton motive existed, but no access or skill in handling the cake. Margaret Willoughby curious about documents, but no access to the kitchen. Clara Dunlop excellent baker, but too scrupulous to risk murder. Cecilia Harrow Long, time housekeeper, intimate knowledge of kitchen routines, always nearby, and seemingly unnoticed. Her mind turned over one critical observation, the footprints and the flower traces. Only someone who knew exactly when and where to move in the manor without being seen could have executed the act. "Yes, it is Cecilia," she whispered softly. "The opportunity, the skill, and the motive are all hers." Gathering everyone together, Miss Marple called for a small gathering in the grand hall, ostensibly to discuss the circumstances and review the events. Villagers and staff assembled, tense and curious. Mrs. Carrington seated herself near the fire, visibly anxious, while Clara Dunlop clutched her hands nervously. Cecilia Harrow stood near the sideboard, composed yet slightly pale. Miss Marple began in her quiet, deliberate manner. "Thank you all for assembling. I know the past few days have been trying, but I believe it is time to understand what truly occurred, so that the Manor may regain its peace." She paused, eyes sweeping the room, settling briefly on each individual. "A tragedy has occurred, yes, but it is only through careful observation that one can see the truth hidden beneath fear and politeness. Let us recall the facts. Step by step reconstruction, Miss Marple recounted the events. The Christmas cake prepared meticulously, but tampered with. Henry Willoughby's collapse sudden, caused by ingestion of a substance hidden in one of the marzipan decorations. Second incident with Eliza, evidence that the poison was present and detectable. Parcel from London missing and possibly connected to motives. As she spoke, subtle reactions emerged, nervous glances, stiffening posture, faint coughs. She noted every micro-expression carefully. The person who did this, she said slowly, had to have access to the kitchen, knowledge of the household routines, and the skill to disguise the act as an accident. They had to act carefully, unnoticed, and yet leave just enough small details to mislead the unsuspecting eye. A hush fell over the room. Confronting the culprit, Miss Marple turned her gaze to Cecilia Harrow, who had been standing stiffly, trying to maintain composure. "Cecilia," she said gently, "you have served this household faithfully for many years. You know its routines, the placement of every utensil, the timing of every delivery. You also know when one might handle a cake without anyone noticing." Cecilia's lips parted, a faint tremor in her hands. I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice calm but slightly strained. Miss Marple's eyes remained steady. "It was you. You prepared the cake for the fete as usual, but you added something extras, something fatal. You wanted Henry gone, perhaps because of the mismanagement you feared he would bring to the estate, or resentment for past slights." Cecilia's head drooped slightly. I did not wish to kill him. I only intended to frighten him, to make him reconsider his ways, but it went wrong. He collapsed immediately." Miss Marple nodded, her expression gentle but firm. "Intent, opportunity, and knowledge, these are the ingredients of truth. You miscalculated the effect, and in doing so, you created chaos." Explanation of motive. Miss Marple addressed the room, outlining the motive for all to hear. Cecilia Harrow had long served the Willoughby family, growing protective of the estate. She feared that Henry's recent decisions regarding property sales, investments, and partnerships could harm the Manor's legacy. She also resented his occasional arrogance and disregard for long-standing staff and traditions. Her plan had been to create a minor scare, a taste of something unpleasant, but in her misjudgment she caused Henry's death. The room was silent. Even Mrs. Carrington's sharp intake of breath was muted by shock. "It is a common misconception," Miss Marple said, "that someone must be cruel to commit such an act. Sometimes fear, anxiety, and misplaced devotion can lead to tragic errors." Cecilia's shoulders slumped, a mixture of relief and sorrow crossing her face. She did not resist when the authorities, summoned earlier, came to take her into custody. The villagers and guests reacted with a mixture of disbelief, compassion, and relief. Clara Dunlop sobbed quietly, grateful her reputation remained untarnished. Mrs. Agnes Fennel whispered to no one in particular, "Well, I never suspected her, though of course I had my doubts about everyone." Reverend Pritchard nodded solemnly. offering comfort where he could. Miss Marple, standing by the fire with her knitting, reflected on the resolution of the case. Human nature is a complex thing. Fear, love, pride, and resentment can mix like ingredients in a cake. Sometimes a single misjudged measure creates tragedy, but careful observation, patience, and understanding, these reveal the truth. Closing observations before the authorities escorted Cecilia away, Miss Marple spoke privately with Mrs. Carrington. Lillian, the manor will recover, but remember, it is the quiet, unnoticed details that often reveal more than the loudest voices. Watch for small changes, subtle gestures. Life is full of lessons, even in tragedy. Mrs. Carrington nodded, tears glistening. "Thank you, Jane. You always know what to look for." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. Outside, the snow continued to fall, softening the landscape. Inside, the warmth of the fire promised that even after tragedy, peace and understanding could be restored. The day following the revelation of Cecilia Harrow's involvement was unusually quiet at Willoughby Manor. The snow outside lay thick and undisturbed, muffling the distant sounds of the village. Inside, the manor moved cautiously, like a household exhaling after a storm. The tragedy of Henry Willoughby's death still hung in the air, but Miss Marple noted with satisfaction that the first stirrings of understanding, acceptance, and reflection were beginning to emerge. Tragedy may touch the surface of life, she thought, but beneath ordinary routines, common sense and compassion endure. Immediate aftermath, the manor staff, still reeling, began to resume normal duties, albeit with subdued expressions. Clara Dunlop, having been reassured of her innocence in the tampering of the cake, busied herself preparing a modest tea service for the remaining household. "Miss Marple," Clara said softly, "I can't tell you how grateful I am that you understood. I feared the village would think me responsible for this, for all the harm. You did nothing wrong," Miss Marple replied gently. Sometimes it is the quietest gestures and the most sincere intentions that avoid suspicion. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carrington wandered the hall, dusting and arranging flowers in her habitual, meticulous way. Yet even she could not entirely mask the tension that lingered. Her eyes often darted toward the pantry, recalling the scene of tragedy, though her resolve slowly strengthened. Returning to village life by mid-morning, word had spread throughout Midsomer Haven. Villagers were cautious in their greetings, hesitant to mention Henry by name. Yet Miss Marple, ever astute, noted small acts of solidarity. A loaf of bread left at the Carringtons' doorstep, kind notes, and gentle inquiries. The village has its own way of dealing with grief, she reflected, sometimes silence, sometimes gossip, but always observation. That is the thread of life here. Even Mrs. Agnes Fennel, known for her penchant for commentary, approached Miss Marple, voice lowered. "Jane, it seems remarkable how you discovered the truth. Cecilia Harrow, one would never have guessed. Yet it makes sense, doesn't it? The housekeeper who knows every corner of the manor every moment of the day." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, Agnes, it is often those who go unnoticed who are best placed to influence events, whether rightly or wrongly." Piecing together the crime, Miss Marple spent the morning meticulously retracing the steps leading up to the fatal moment. The cake, carefully prepared by Clara, left in the pantry overnight. Cecilia, aware of Henry's habits, knew he would take the ceremonial first bite. She had discreetly placed a poisoned marzipan decoration atop the cake. The bitter almond scent was faint but detectable to a careful observer. Opportunity, Cecilia had moved freely through the kitchen at night, attending to chores while remaining unseen. Her knowledge of the manor's layout allowed her to manipulate events without drawing suspicion. Motive, protecting the estate, correcting Henry's impulsive decisions, and a sense of loyalty twisted into fatal misjudgment. Miss Marple reflected, Intent does not excuse outcome. Cecilia's devotion became misdirected, and she miscalculated the consequences. Human error, ambition, and fear, all ingredients that led to this disaster. The confession later that afternoon, after the authorities had formally questioned Cecilia, Miss Marple sat beside her in the small sunlit room of the Manor. "I understand now," Cecilia whispered, voice trembling, "how wrong I was. I only wanted to protect the family, to make him reconsider, but he never had a chance." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand over hers. "Yes, Cecilia, it is a tragic misjudgment, not cruelty, but you must accept that life often teaches us through consequences." Tears ran down Cecilia's face, and for the first time she allowed herself to be truly vulnerable. Rebuilding relationships in the days that followed, the village and manor began a slow restoration of calm. Mrs. Carrington worked tirelessly to maintain order, organizing flowers and decorations while ensuring the staff felt supported. Clara Dunlop returned to her bakery with renewed vigor, encouraged by the knowledge that her skill and reputation remained intact. Margaret Willoughby, Henry's cousin, quietly handled the estate's finances, guided by Miss Marple's advice, ensuring the property remained secure and the family's interests protected. Miss Marple observed all these developments with a satisfied eye. People, when given the truth and gentle guidance, often found their own path back to normalcy. A village gathering to mark the conclusion of the ordeal, Mrs. Carrington invited villagers for a modest tea in the manor's grand hall. The mood was cautious but warm. The crisis had bonded many in ways subtle and enduring. Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting needles clicking softly, observing familiar faces, Reverend Pritchard offering comfort to the Carringtons, Clara Dunlop carefully arranging pastries, a quiet smile returning to her face, Agnes Fennell whispering observations to the nearest neighbour, her usual curiosity tempered by relief. Even Cecilia, though absent, lingered in conversation, discussed respectfully for her service and acknowledged for her tragic misjudgment. Lessons learned. Miss Marple mused over the events as the snow fell gently outside, reflecting on human nature and the intricacies of village life. People are like a delicate recipe, she thought. Every ingredient, pride, fear, love, resentment, must be carefully balanced. One small deviation can create disaster, yet with patience and observation the pattern reveals itself. Understanding, rather than anger, often brings peace. The festive decorations, once overshadowed by tragedy, now seemed brighter. The manor, though marked by loss, regained a sense of rhythm and routine. Life, as ever, moved forward. The final reflection before departing the manor, Miss Marple had a quiet conversation with Mrs. Carrington. "Lilian, remember this," she said gently. "Even in the smallest villages and the quietest households, the truth can be uncovered. Sometimes it is patience, observation, and a willingness to see beyond appearances that reveal the heart of events." Mrs. Carrington nodded, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "You have a remarkable way of seeing things, Jane. I don't know what we would have done without you." Miss Marple smiled, picking up her knitting basket. "Ah, Lilian, one must simply pay attention. Life, like a cake, has many layers, and sometimes the hidden ones contain the most important truths." With that, she stepped outside into the snowy morning, the village quiet and serene. The manor, the people, and the small community of Midsomer Haven could now breathe easier. The tragedy had been resolved, the guilty identified, and the lessons learned, and in the warm glow of the Christmas season, life resumed its gentle, unassuming course.